I had worked at the company for over 12 years. 12 years of my life, poured into a firm that I thought valued loyalty, knowledge, and the countless late nights I spent making sure projects never collapsed. I wasn't one of those flashy employees, the kind who dazzled everyone with their networking or their corporate charisma. No, I was the quiet one, the one who sat in the background, ensuring all the certifications, licenses, and compliance systems that held the company together were spotless. Nobody praised me for it, but everyone unknowingly relied on it. That was until he walked in, the new manager. He arrived with the swagger of someone who thought the company owed him its existence. A man with slick words, an expensive suit, and a condescending smile that never reached his eyes. From the moment he walked in, I knew he had already made up his mind about me. I was old blood. In his world, old blood was a stain that needed to be scrubbed clean so he could build his empire in its place. The first week, he barely acknowledged me. The second, he started dropping comments about how the company needed streamlining and efficiency. By the third, he started holding morning meetings where he referred to entire departments as dead weight. I should have seen it coming. One Wednesday morning, I was called into his office. He didn't even look up when I entered, just kept typing away on his laptop with a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Close the door," he said flatly. I obeyed, trying to keep my expression neutral. Without any build-up, he leaned back in his chair and announced, "We're making some changes around here. Your position has been reviewed, and I'm afraid it's been marked redondant, redondant." That word echoed in my mind like a gunshot. I blinked at him, confused. Redundant? I've been here over a decade. Every license, every single compliance measure runs through me. He finally looked at me, his eyes glinting with arrogance. "Look, you've been doing administrative work, important at one time maybe, but we have automated systems now, AI tools. Young talent who can learn in weeks what you've been doing for years. You're replaceable. Replaceable." My chest tightened, but I didn't let him see the sting. Instead, I folded my hands neatly in front of me and asked, "And the CEO approved this?" He smirked wider. "The CEO trusts my judgment. I was brought here to cut costs. People like you're relics of the past. Honestly, you should be grateful you've lasted this long." I nodded slowly, my heart pounding. "And what about my certifications?" He frowned, waving a dismissive hand. "Those will transfer whatever's needed. HR will sort it out. It's all paperwork, right?" That was the moment I realized he had no idea. He didn't know what he had just done. He thought I was some desk clerk pushing papers. He had no clue that my certification wasn't just paperwork. It was the foundation of the company's operating license. I felt a strange calm wash over me. He had just signed the company's death warrant. And he didn't even know it. "Understood," I said softly. I stood up, slid my company badge across the desk, and walked out without another word. On the elevator ride down, my colleagues gave me sympathetic looks. Word spread fast in corporate halls, and I could see the pity in their eyes. Some whispered, "She didn't deserve that." Others simply avoided my gaze, too afraid of drawing attention from the tyrant upstairs. As I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, a wave of emotions crashed over me: anger, betrayal, disbelief. But beneath it all there was something else, something sharp, like the edge of a blade: satisfaction. Because what my arrogant new boss didn't know, and what the CEO had clearly forgotten, was that the company's operating license for its entire financial division was tied to me, to my name. Not the department, not the firm, not even the CEO. Me. Years ago, when the company had applied for its global compliance license, they needed someone who carried a very specific rare certification. Out of hundreds of thousands of professionals, fewer than 50 people worldwide held it. I happened to be one of them. The board had begged me to sign the license application back then, promising promotions, stability, and long-term security. I signed, thinking it was just another step in my career, but what it really meant was this: if I left the company, their license would become invalid. It wasn't transferable. It wasn't something HR could sort out. It was tied to me, and me alone. And they had just fired me. For the first few days, I stayed silent. I didn't call. I didn't warn them. I didn't even acknowledge the emails HR sent asking me to return company property that they forgot to collect. I just watched from the sidelines, sipping coffee at home, scrolling through LinkedIn as if nothing had happened. But in the back of my mind, I knew what was coming, because in less than 2 weeks, the company was set to finalize a $1 billion contract with an international client, a contract that explicitly required their compliance license, my license, to remain active. Without it, the deal would collapse. I could already picture the chaos brewing in their offices. Some poor IT intern probably running diagnostics, managers screaming at one another, the CEO furiously calling the board, trying to figure out why their systems kept flagging invalid license across every compliance document. Meanwhile, I sat back and let it happen. Every time my phone buzzed with a new message from a colleague, "Hey, they're asking if you can come back for a quick consult," I ignored it. Every time LinkedIn showed me another post from my ex-manager bragging about his cost-cutting initiatives and streamlined efficiency, I smiled to myself, knowing the storm that was about to hit him. Redundant, replaceable, paperwork. Let's see him call it paperwork when the company he just gutted collapses in flames. I didn't have to wait long for the cracks to appear. 3 days after I walked out, my phone lit up with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer it, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello?" A nervous voice came through the line. "Hi, this is Connor from compliance. You worked here before, right? We're seeing some weird flags on our system, like some license issue. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that?" I bit back a laugh. He didn't even know who I was. Just worked here before. That's how quickly a company forgets you. I spoke calmly. "What kind of flags?" Like invalid license codes. But I mean, it's probably just a technical thing. We'll sort it out." His voice cracked slightly on the last part, like even he didn't believe it. "Well," I said evenly, "good luck with that." Then I hung up. For the next week, the calls multiplied, sometimes from blocked numbers, sometimes from panicked coworkers I hadn't spoken to in months. HR left me voicemails that started off polite and professional, but quickly turned desperate. "We'd love to have a quick chat. We think there may have been an oversight. Please. It's urgent. Can you call us back today?" I ignored them all. By the 10th day, I started hearing whispers. A friend in IT, one of the few decent people left there, texted me late at night. "They're losing their minds. The international client is demanding proof of compliance before signing the deal, and everything keeps bouncing. CEO's furious. New boss looks like he's about to combust." I almost felt bad for them. Almost. The morning of the 11th day, I woke up to chaos exploding on my social media. The company had trended on LinkedIn and Twitter. Posts about unexplained delays, possible fraud, and regulatory violations were spreading like wildfire. Someone had leaked that their $1 billion deal was in jeopardy, and investors were panicking. Stock prices were already dipping. I sat at my kitchen table sipping tea, scrolling through the news feeds. Each headline was sweeter than the last. Global firm faces licensing. Crisis ahead of major contract. Anonymous. Sources reveal compliance failure. Investors question leadership after sudden setback. Anonymous sources. I almost laughed. If only they knew the truth. There wasn't anything sudden about this. It had been brewing since the moment their shiny new boss shoved me out the door. That afternoon, the phone rang again. This time, the caller ID displayed the CEO's name. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hello, this is Margaret," I said smoothly, as if I didn't already know who it was. "Margaret." His voice was tight, measured, as though each syllable was being squeezed through clenched teeth. "We need to talk." I leaned back in my chair, pretending to think. "I don't work for you anymore. I'm not sure what there is to talk about." He sighed, frustration leaking through. "Look, we may have overlooked something when your position was eliminated. It seems there are certain certifications tied to your credentials." "Oh?" I asked innocently. Certifications that HR said were just paperwork? Silence. Then stiffly. We'd like to bring you back. As a consultant. Just temporarily, of course. You'd be compensated generously. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. Generously. And how long would that last? Until you think you can transfer what you called paperwork. His voice hardened. Margaret, the company is under enormous pressure. This deal is critical. You don't want to make an enemy of us. There it was, the threat. Subtle, but unmistakable. I let a beat pass, then replied coolly, Funny. I thought you already made an enemy when you fired me. Then I hung up. 2 days later, things escalated. I was out grocery shopping when I noticed a black SUV parked at the end of my street. The same SUV was there again the next morning, and again in the evening when I returned from a walk. I wasn't paranoid. They were watching me. Sure enough, another voicemail appeared on my phone that night. Margaret, we really don't want this to get messy. Just call us back. We can work something out. Messy. They were desperate now. And while they scrambled, I was finally breathing. For the first time in years, I wasn't chained to endless corporate reports or late-night system audits. I had peace. And more importantly, I had leverage. Because here's what they still didn't realize. It wasn't just the compliance license. Every single digital key, every system override, every kill switch, those were mine too. I hadn't hoarded them out of malice. It was simply my job to know the skeleton of the company inside and out. I had built the contingency systems, written the backup protocols, and personally tested every failsafe. If anyone else touched them without me, the system would eat itself alive. So when the compliance license failed, it wasn't just paperwork. Entire systems began unraveling. Auto-renewals on contracts froze. Regulatory reports bounced. The company's financial backbone was cracking apart, one algorithm at a time. And they had no idea how to stop it. By the end of the month, the board of directors had had enough. I didn't need inside sources to tell me. They practically broadcasted it. News outlets reported executive shakeups, internal conflicts, and loss of investor confidence. The billion-dollar deal was officially dead, and rumors spread that the client was suing for breach of contract. Then came the headline I had been waiting for. Arrogant new manager resigns amid company meltdown. Resigns. That was the polite word they used, but I knew what it really meant. He hadn't resigned. He had been thrown to the wolves, sacrificed to appease shareholders. I imagined him packing his expensive suit jackets into a cardboard box, fury burning in his eyes as he realized that all his efficiency cuts had detonated in his face. And me? I wasn't done yet, because while the company was crumbling, they still hadn't apologized. Not truly. Every voicemail, every email, every message, they all had the same undertone. We need you, because we're desperate. Not because I mattered. Not because I had value, but because I was the last rope keeping them from drowning. So I stayed silent. Then, on a quiet Friday evening, the knock came at my door. When I opened it, I nearly laughed out loud. There stood the CEO himself. Not some assistant, not HR, not a lawyer, the CEO. He looked 10 years older than when I'd last seen him, his hair disheveled, his eyes sunken. "Margaret," he said hoarsely, "please, we need to talk." For a moment, I let him stand there, the mighty leader of a billion-dollar empire reduced to begging on my doorstep. Then I stepped aside. He walked in, sat heavily on my couch, and rubbed his temples. "I'll be honest, we're in deep trouble. The license, the systems, everything is unraveling. And our investors?" He stopped, choking on the words. I folded my arms. "You fired me. You called me redundant. And now you're here." His shoulders sagged. "I made a mistake. We made a mistake. Margaret, I'm sorry." Finally, the words I'd been waiting for. But apologies weren't enough. I leaned forward, my voice cold and steady. "If I come back, it won't be as an employee, not as a consultant, not as some temporary patch. If I return, I come back as a partner, full equity, full decision-making power, or nothing." His eyes widened, And for the first time that evening, he looked afraid. Because he knew I meant it. And he knew I held every single card. I answered his voicemail the next morning because I wanted to hear the desperation in his voice again, up close. He had called me twice in the night after sitting on my couch, the words partner and equity repeating like a bad dream in my head. He'd left messages begging, explaining, promising. I wanted to know if the same man who had shoved a box into my arms and told me to leave in the dark would actually offer me something that mattered. "Margaret," he began as if he'd rehearsed the syllables. "We don't have time for games." "No," I said, calm and cold. "We don't. So tell me what you plan to do to keep this company alive, without me." Silence on the other end, long and ragged. "We'll offer you a partnership. A minority stake, say 5 to 10%. Board seat, limited authority." He rattled off items like a man reading from a script. "You think you can slap numbers on my dignity and call it justice?" I interrupted. 5 to 10%? A board seat with limited authority? I'm the person who holds the compliance keys for your global operations. Not a consultant, not a fixer. If I return, I will own my place in this firm, legally and irrevocably. Full partnership or I walk. You know what happens if you walk." He inhaled sharply. "We can't give you that. Shareholders. You told me you were building an empire today," I said. "Build one that can live without my name if you can, or accept that you need me and sign the papers." I left the consequence unsaid. He knew them. He'd already lived the taste. That conversation set the tone. He called lawyers. Board members called each other in frantic chains. And I sat in my rented apartment with a cup of coffee cooling beside me, while the company imploded in fits and starts. In those days, I learned a new rhythm of living. Waiting, listening, moving when necessary, never acting on anyone else's timeline. Negotiation in a crisis is chess, not checkers. I needed allies who were smarter than his sycophants and less frightened than the board. So I called the lawyer who'd read the will, the man who had not only been competent but humane. He'd helped me in small ways. Advice on managing the press, contacts at a boutique investigative firm. I told him bluntly I needed legal cover to negotiate and, if necessary, to show the board evidence of the corruption I'd found. He hesitated, worried about exposure, but he also knew the company's collapse would bring legal and financial ruin to many innocent employees. He agreed. With legal counsel secured, I drafted a set of non-negotiables. Not demands born of spite, but terms forged from practical necessity and the lessons the company had ignored. Transparency and governance, independent audits, binding protection for the compliance function, and my equity stake, structured in such a way that it couldn't be diluted without my explicit consent. I wanted a seat at the table. I wanted my role codified so a future fabricator couldn't strip it away. I made the mistake of letting a little compassion mix with strategy when I reached out to a former colleague, Daniel, who was still fighting in the trenches. He answered, voice exhausted. "We're on life support, Marg. The client is suing. The auditors flagged 6 inconsistencies. People are terrified. Some are saying the board sold us out." That morning, I went to the company building for the first time since the reading. The security guard recognized me and hesitated for a heartbeat, eye contact like a test. The lobby smelled of stale coffee and panic. People who once greeted me with casual warmth now looked through me like glass. I walked to the elevator and up to the floor where the executive offices had made the headlines. The board had convened an emergency meeting and left plastic cups and undone sandwiches on the conference table. Blank stares. An atmosphere of exhausted men in suits pretending to hold together an impossible thing. I requested a meeting with the chairman. He was older, the sort of man who had learned to keep his hands clean by making others dirty. He offered tea and a tired smile, but his fingers trembled when he signed the visitor log. He had the look of someone who had calculated risk his entire life and finally miscounted. "We can't give you everything," he began, unbidden. "The shareholders will revolt. The buyout terms, the valuation. You don't get to lecture me about shareholders when you voted to cut the person who ensured regulatory compliance," I said. "You had to know what would happen when you removed me. Why pretend surprise now?" He sighed. "It's not that simple." "No," I said. "It's very simple. I return as a partner with legal protection for the compliance function, specific veto power over governance changes that affect regulatory standing, and a guaranteed portion of equity that can't be diluted without my consent. Also, finder's fees and back pay. I want the board to acknowledge they were wrong to fire me. He stared, calculating. I watched his face closely. Boardrooms are filled with men who assume you can't stitch together the courage to hold out for what you deserve. They assume financial desperation will beat principle. They forget the person across from them is not always the person they think they broke. I'll need time, he said slowly. Time is what sunk your ship, I replied. Either sign or prepare to face the legal consequences. Your new manager cost you a deal, deliberately or ignorantly. You will have to explain that to the regulator. For the next week, the company turned itself inside out trying to convince me to accept less. They promised to fire the arrogant manager, the man who'd called me redundant, to make public apologies, to restructure governance. But words are cheap. I would not re-enter my old life with promises. There were threats too. Discreet men in expensive cars waited outside my building one night. A business acquaintance who had once been amiable suddenly sent me a veiled email about the consequences of standing in the way of shareholder value. The world had changed in 12 years. Violence had a cost, but fear could be manufactured in countless softer ways. Someone made a call to an old landlord I'd had to fight with years ago. My phone buzzed with anonymous numbers. I slept with one eye open and practiced the art of appearing unbothered because anger is a tool, and you must be a master of it, not its servant. The pressure built into a heat that you can sense in the bones. Some of it came from the company, some from reputations and investments that now teetered, but part of it came from inside me. The realization that if I failed now, the rot would continue. He'd rebuilt himself somewhere else, and the same predators would leap onto another corpse. When the board finally offered me a formal contract, they came with 2 lawyers, 2 technicians, and an auditor who insisted on a non-disclosure agreement layered so deep even the language smelled like oil. They wanted to keep the transition discreet. They wanted to contain the narrative so the client could be placated and shareholders soothed. I didn't sign anything that first meeting. Instead, I took the flash drive and the printed records I had gathered, the ones that showed how certain vendor accounts had been empty shells, how payments were routed through subsidiaries that paid little tax in nations where oversight meant the ocean. I placed a stack of copies on the chairman's desk and said, "If you try to gaslight me, these go to the regulator and 3 independent journalists. If you try to dilute my equity later, the same goes to the regulator and the SEC." He blanched. He saw the path to ruin for the company he'd steered into the rocks. He also saw the path back, a staffed, transparent operation, a restructured board, and, if done correctly, an image rehabilitation that could stem the hemorrhage. When he left, he had a different color in his face. He was being forced into honesty by the very person he'd dismissed as redundant. My conditions were specific and precise, because I'd spent my career operating in the margins where precision mattered. They included not just the equity and the role, but the mechanisms that would protect us, emergency access protocols, audit trails I controlled, provisions for independent audits by third parties of any financial transfers related to client accounts, a veto power on the appointment of anyone to the compliance role or to any position that could impact regulatory status, a clause guaranteeing that if any attempts were made to sideline these protections, I would be notified and have immediate recourse. The board argued about language and thresholds. One director, a young woman who had been trying to make sense of the company's wreckage, finally said, "You're not asking for special favors. You're asking for the safeguards that should exist in a well-run company." The room fell silent. It's astonishing how one person unwilling to be cowed can change the tenor of a place. They saw in her voice the reflection of what I'd been saying for years. I signed, eventually, because why would I not? The terms were reasonable, binding, and legally bulletproof. I returned to the firm under contract as partner, with a safety net that took the sting from his threats, but did not dull the lessons. Yet returning to a place you once loved is never seamless. The corridors were the same but haunted by different ghosts. Some people stared as if they were waiting for me to fail. Others smiled with a mixture of guilt and relief. The public statement the board released praised my return as a reunification with a visionary leader, and praised the renewed dedication to compliance. I'd written that visionary part in the drafts. Public perception matters. Within 24 hours of my return, the demands intensified. The client wanted immediate answers, auditors wanted proof, and regulators wanted reports. That was the easy part. The hard part was the blowback. Board members who wanted to shift blame, a cozy group of executives who'd enjoyed the perks of the old system, and the restless man who had been ousted, but who could still rally allies outside the glass walls. He resurfaced in the press as a victim to a smear campaign. He played the martyr in interviews and painted me as an opportunist. I'd been ready for the narrative. It's easy for a man to cry witch hunt, and for some people to believe him. But the evidence, cold, immovable, was my ally now. The first test came fast. An overnight audit flagged an obscure vendor account that had been processed under a secondary authorization. The transaction was small, but the trail led to offshore accounts, and then to an empty shell company. Whoever set this up had been careful, but not careful enough. I moved faster than I thought I could. I wrote a script that tracked the authorization keys and mapped the transactions to IP addresses. I coordinated with the IT team who had been sidelined earlier, but were now quietly the best of the best. Talent that had been pushed out or minimized by the arrogant boss. Together, we traced the transaction to a group of accounts that had been used as buffers for cash extraction. Within a week, we had names, vendors, intermediaries. Tiny trusts opened and closed like trapdoors in the legal systems of low-regulatory countries. That's when the threats took a new form. A member of my team found a note on his car. "Drop it, or you lose more than your job." Another morning, a journalist called claiming there were rumors of fabricated evidence. The man I had once loved was now using every resource he had to discredit us. Private investigators, smear merchants, even pressure on the legal firms we were using. But what he hadn't counted on was cohesion. The employees I'd once helped in small ways, staying late to advise a junior analyst, recommending someone for a training course, were now my knights. They didn't all love me, but they believed in a company that did what it promised clients and regulators. They believed in systems that worked. And when one of them was threatened, a dozen more stood up. Life in a firm is a web of favors and loyalties. You give, and sometimes it comes back when you need it the most. I also began reaching out to the regulators directly. It's a delicate dance. You don't go marching in with accusations without being certain of your ground. But I was certain. I provided them with the evidence, the transaction trails, the emails. Regulators move slowly, but they move. We had to let them follow their protocols. Too much theater and the whole thing collapses into procedural dismissal. A week later, the regulator visited the firm. They didn't make a spectacle, but their phones did not stop. The message got out. A thorough investigation was underway. The company had little choice but to cooperate. Some board members tried the old gambit. Blame HR, blame the now resigned manager. But I had built my case on proof, not gossip. The truth is harder to wiggle away from. There were other small victories. I renegotiated parts of the business with the client by demonstrating that we now had independent oversight and that our compliance function was bound to transparent audit processes. The client, wary but pragmatic, extended deadlines and required more oversight. Costly for us, expensive for our shareholders, but survivable. One morning, an email arrived that changed everything. The chairman forwarded minutes from a board meeting that occurred in the months before my firing. There, in lawyer's notes, was the language we'd found on the flash drive. A pattern of wire transfers that did not align with business needs. The chairman had missed it. Or perhaps he'd chosen to ignore it. Either way, now that it was public, those minutes could not be unwound. The board's shaky coalition began to fracture. The arrogant man, meanwhile, tried something desperate. He attempted to smear me with forged emails, suggesting I had colluded with outside parties to sabotage the company. His team planted a false document in the system, and then leaked an excerpt to a tabloid. It read convincingly for someone who only wanted a headline. He'd underestimated two things: the depth of my knowledge of the company's inner workings, and how obsessively I archived communications. We pulled logs from every relevant system, tracked edits, and soon proved the document's origin. The leak's metadata traced not to me or to any of my allies, but to a proxy server that tied back to an IP range associated with vendors he still had control over. He had painted a picture of me, but his brushstrokes were sloppy. Publicly exposing the forgery didn't just clear my name, it tore open the stage on which he performed. Investors started to speak. A major institutional shareholder called for an independent forensic audit. Within days, people who had once supported him were either quietly distancing themselves or demanding answers. By late autumn, the landscape had shifted. The man who had sneered at me for being replaceable was under indictment in multiple jurisdictions and subject to civil suits from creditors and clients. He had tried to erase me, but in trying, he'd exposed himself and the network that had enabled his greed. My return to the company had not been about vindictiveness. It was about cleaning a wound before it killed the patient. As I sat in the new office they had offered me, larger than my previous cubicle but not ostentatious, I reflected on what we'd done. People often imagine revenge as a single blaze of glory. In truth, it was months of cold work, of refusing to be intimidated, of building alliances, of meticulous documentation. It was 1,000 small choices made not in fury, but in clarity. There were nights I still felt afraid. There were mornings I doubted how far I'd gone. But every time fear crept in, I remembered the man's face the night he told me to leave, and how he'd looked when he was handcuffed. And more importantly, I remembered the quiet voice of my father-in-law, the only person who had ever truly seen me. He had left me not just money or license, but a responsibility. To the company, to the people who depended on it, and to myself. When the final settlements were arranged, the company offered me not only the equity we'd agreed upon, but a clause that guaranteed the compliance function's independence, an external audit cadence, and a public transparency report on financial flows. They also agreed to fund a foundation in my father-in-law's name, to represent the ethical standards he'd tried to instill. It was ironic, perhaps, that the man who had treated me as nothing had, in his final act, entrusted me with a chance to make something better. Victory didn't erase the scars. It simply turned them into lines of meaning, proof that I survived and rebuilt. I'd walked out once in the dark, believing myself worthless. I came back with partners at the table and the authority to make sure no one could wield the company as a personal piggy bank again. And when the tabloids tried, for one last time, to cast me as the villain of my own story, the facts, paper after paper, log after log, kept proving them wrong. The truth has weight. It sinks in the world eventually. In the quiet moments, when the city lights blurred and the office hummed with the low buzz of work that actually mattered, I stood by the window and allowed myself to imagine a life beyond the spreadsheets and the court filings. Not because I wanted to escape the work I'd rebuilt, but because I wanted the company to be a place that nurtured people, rather than chewed them up when convenient. That was the real revenge, transforming a place that thought it could discard me into an institution that would not let that happen to anyone else. I had not set out to be a heroine. I had set out to survive, and in surviving, I had found the authority to change things. I had thought the storm was over. I had thought my revenge was complete. But in reality, it was only the beginning of a much darker game. After my company collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance, my former bosses vanished into silence. The COO, the one who had pushed hardest for my termination, left the city in disgrace. The others scrambled for new jobs, their reputations shredded by the very systems they had stolen from me. For weeks, I savored the sweet satisfaction of having outsmarted them. I thought I was free, but then the phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but something told me to pick up. On the other end, a man's voice, low, steady, and carrying the kind of authority you don't question. "Miss Evans?" he asked. "Yes," I said cautiously. "This is Special Agent Howard with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to talk. It's about your former employer." My stomach dropped. The FBI? What could they possibly want with me? I agreed to meet the next morning. The agent showed up with another official, and they laid everything out in stark, terrifying detail. My old company hadn't just been corrupt. They'd been laundering money, selling proprietary systems to foreign entities, and using manipulated contracts to defraud their own shareholders. And the kicker? My name was all over the paperwork. My heart raced as the realization sank in. They had planned this from the start. By tying my name to licenses, contracts, and compliance systems, they hadn't just tried to use me. They had made me the perfect scapegoat. I sat frozen as the agents explained the scope. Millions of dollars missing. Encrypted transfers routed through servers I had once overseen. Every digital fingerprint pointed back at me. I didn't do this, I said desperately. They fired me. They locked me out of everything. I had no access. Howard leaned forward, eyes sharp. Then prove it. We think you're innocent, but we need evidence. You're the only person who knew their systems inside out. If you can help us, we'll clear your name. If you can't, well, the courts will have to decide. It felt like the room was spinning. I had just fought to take back my dignity, and now I was staring down the possibility of prison for crimes I hadn't committed. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk, staring at the encrypted drives I had once created. Somewhere inside them was the truth, the proof of their crimes and the proof of my innocence. But I also knew this. Going back into the system meant walking straight into a minefield. If I failed, I'd look guilty. If I succeeded, I might uncover things darker than I ever imagined. Still, what choice did I have? The next morning, I plugged in the first drive. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. It felt strange, almost poetic. Me, the woman they had underestimated, now holding the only chance of justice. Hours passed. I dove deeper into their networks, retracing old paths, cracking through encrypted files I had once designed myself. And then I found it, a hidden directory, buried under innocuous system logs. Inside were dozens of files labeled with names I didn't recognize, but the contents chilled me. Offshore bank accounts, shell corporations, transaction histories with numbers so large they hardly looked real. And then, an email chain. My name, my employee ID, attached to forged authorizations. Documents signed in my digital signature, authorizing illegal transfers. My breath caught in my throat. They hadn't just planned to ruin me. They had been laying the groundwork for months. I brought everything to the FBI. They scanned through the evidence, their faces hardening. You realize what this means? Howard said. They weren't just targeting you. They were using the company as a cover for something much bigger. This goes beyond corporate fraud. This is organized crime. The words hung heavy in the air. From that day forward, my life became a blur of meetings, interrogations, and coded extractions. I became their inside weapon, the one person who could unravel the empire my ex-employers had built. It was dangerous, exhausting, and terrifying. I was followed more than once. My email was hacked. One night I even found a note slipped under my apartment door. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. But the threats only fueled me. Because beneath the fear was something else, a fire. These people had taken everything from me, my job, my reputation, my peace of mind. Now they were trying to destroy me completely, and I refused to let them win. For weeks, I worked side by side with the FBI, tracing every dirty deal, every transfer, every forged signature. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. The faces behind the fraud weren't just executives. They were tied to powerful investors, politicians, even international players. The day of reckoning finally came. I was invited to testify in front of a federal grand jury. My heart pounded as I walked into the courtroom, clutching the files I had pulled from the wreckage. Across the room I saw them, the very people who had laughed at me, belittled me, discarded me. Their eyes widened when they realized who the government's star witness was. I told my story. Every betrayal, every forged document, every threat. I laid it all bare, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. And when I was done, I looked directly at the COO, the man who had signed my termination papers, and I said, "You tried to erase me, but I was the one piece of your system you could never control." The silence in the room was electric. By the end of that trial, indictments were handed down. The executives who had once ruled like gods were now facing years, decades behind bars. Their empire crumbled overnight. But here's the twist that no one saw coming. Not even me. Instead of walking away, instead of retreating into anonymity, I was offered something extraordinary. A consortium of investors, ethical ones, people who had watched the company's downfall with disgust, approached me. They wanted me to lead a new venture, one built on integrity, transparency, and the very systems I had once been mocked for designing. At first I hesitated. I was tired, worn down, but then I thought about everything I had been through, all the times I had been underestimated, silenced, erased, and I realized something. Survival wasn't enough. Revenge wasn't enough. What I wanted now was legacy, so I said yes. The years that followed were the hardest and most rewarding of my life. I built something new, something unshakable. A company not defined by greed, but by resilience and truth. My name, once nearly destroyed, became a symbol of survival. And sometimes, late at night, I think back to the day they fired me. The smug faces, the laughter, the arrogance. If only they had known the truth, that firing me wasn't their victory. It was their downfall, and it was the beginning of my rise. Because here's the lesson I've learned, the one I want anyone listening to carry with them. Never let someone else define your worth. Never let their betrayal write your ending, because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's proving that they were never capable of destroying you. I used to think the worst day of my life was the day they fired me, but now looking back, I realize it wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning. The true storm came later, when I thought I had won, when I thought I had finally taken back control. That's when I learned that victories can be illusions, and revenge can open doors you never intended to step through. After the company's collapse, I allowed myself a small taste of peace. I walked through the city like a woman reborn, no longer carrying the shame of their dismissal. I was no longer invisible. For the first time in years, I felt seen by myself. But peace never lasts long in stories like mine. The call from the FBI shattered everything. Their voices were calm, professional, but their words hit me like ice water. Money laundering, fraud, offshore accounts, my name on documents authorizing transfers worth millions. At first, I laughed. A sharp, disbelieving sound. That's impossible, I told them. I didn't even have access after they fired me. But they weren't joking. The agents showed me the evidence. Screenshots of digital authorizations, transaction logs tied to my employee ID, even emails signed with my encrypted key. And suddenly the blood drained from my face. These weren't just accusations. Someone had built an entire false identity around me, brick by brick, preparing to use me as their shield while they dug deeper into corruption. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spiraling. How far would they go? Had they always planned to destroy me, even before firing me? Or had they chosen me afterward because I was the perfect scapegoat, an expendable employee with technical access and no power to defend herself? Fear crept into every corner of my life. I started noticing shadows that lingered a little too long, footsteps behind me on empty streets. My email accounts were breached, my messages scrambled. Once, coming home late, I found my apartment door slightly ajar. Inside, nothing was missing, but I could feel it. Someone had been there, watching, waiting. I wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. I was fighting for survival. So when Agent Howard gave me a choice, cooperate with them and clear my name or risk going down with the criminals, I didn't hesitate. I wasn't going to let them win. I threw myself into the work. For weeks, I lived in the shadows of digital architecture, tracing lines of code like footprints in the snow. The systems I had once built now became my weapon. And as I dug deeper, I discovered more than I expected. Buried in encrypted drives was a secret directory, a vault of evidence no one was supposed to find. Offshore bank accounts tied to powerful investors. Fake contracts funneled through shell companies. Millions of dollars moved like pieces on a chessboard. And worst of all, emails. Hundreds of them, with my digital signature authorizing the fraud. The realization made my hands shake. They hadn't just ruined me, they had erased me. In the eyes of the law, I was the criminal. But I wasn't broken. Not this time. I brought the files to the FBI. I watched their faces shift from skepticism to grim recognition. "You realize what this means?" Howard said, voice low. "This isn't just corporate greed. This is organized crime, and you're the only one who can take them down." The weight of it all nearly crushed me. Organized crime, billion-dollar fraud. My enemies weren't just executives. They were linked to politicians, Global investors, people with power I could barely comprehend. But that was the moment I made my choice. I would not run. I would not hide. I would fight. The threats escalated quickly. A black car idling outside my building, anonymous calls with silence on the other end. And then, the note under my door. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. I stared at that note for a long time. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from fury. For years, they had underestimated me. They thought they could discard me, then destroy me, and I would just disappear. They thought I had no power, but they were wrong. They had forgotten one thing. I built the system they thought they controlled. And now, I was the only one who could dismantle it. I spent sleepless nights combing through data, every keystroke fueled by rage and determination. I cracked into servers they thought were unbreakable, followed encrypted trails through firewalls they believed would never fall. Piece by piece, I reconstructed their empire, not to admire it, but to tear it down. The day came when I was called to testify. I'll never forget walking into that grand jury courtroom. My heart thundered in my chest as I saw them. The same executives who had sneered at me, dismissed me, laughed at me. Their suits were immaculate, their arrogance still visible, but their eyes flickered with something new. Fear. I told my story. From the moment they hired me, to the day they fired me, to the forged signatures and secret accounts, my voice didn't waver, not once, because for the first time, I wasn't just speaking for myself. I was speaking for every person who had ever been silenced, dismissed, underestimated. And then I looked straight at the COO, the man who had signed my termination papers, and I said the words I had waited years to say. You tried to erase me. But I was the one part of your system you could never control. The silence that followed was like thunder. By the end of the trial, the verdict was clear. Indictments, convictions, prison sentences. Their empire crumbled in a single stroke, not because of revenge, but because the truth was undeniable. But here's the part I never saw coming. When the dust settled, when the criminals were behind bars and the company was no more, I expected to feel empty. I thought victory would leave me hollow. Instead, something unexpected happened. A group of investors, real ones, people who valued integrity, approached me. They had watched the trial, seen the evidence, and recognized something I hadn't even recognized in myself. You don't just have technical skill, one of them said. You have resilience, vision, leadership. We want you to lead something new. At first, I resisted. I was tired, broken in places I didn't even know how to fix. But slowly the idea took root. Why not? Why shouldn't I build something better? Something that couldn't be corrupted? Something that would outlive even me? So I said yes. The years that followed were not easy. Building a new company from the ashes of betrayal was a war in itself. But I poured everything into it, my pain, my anger, my hope, and piece by piece it grew. I became more than the girl they fired, more than the scapegoat, more than the witness. I became the founder of something unshakable. And sometimes, late at night, I think back to the day it all started. That smug smile across the table, that dismissal, that arrogance. If only they had known the truth, firing me wasn't their victory. It was their downfall, because they forgot the one thing no enemy should ever forget. When you push someone to the edge, when you strip them of everything, you don't destroy them. You awaken them. And once awakened, they will rise higher than you ever imagined. That's my story. Not of revenge, not of survival, but of rebirth.